Greenland is in the news thanks to Donald Trump. He had a terrible phone conversation with the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, where he apparently repeated his threat to even use military invasion to get Greenland.
President Trump is doubling down on his efforts to acquire Greenland from Denmark, and now the Danish government is pushing back. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen started a diplomatic blitz across Europe, meeting with officials in Berlin and Paris.
Greenland belongs to Denmark, surprisingly enough. That's one of the issues we're going to go into. Also, what might be behind Donald Trump actually wanting to buy the world's largest island? What's the track record of the Americans on Greenland, because they've had an air base there for a very long time, and the Danish track record, and what's likely to happen next? But let's start at the beginning. That pretty dreadful conversation described by the Danes as horrendous. Apparently, the threat to militarily occupy Greenland was repeated. Quite astonishing when you consider that Greenland belongs to Denmark. Denmark is a member of NATO. The States are still a member of NATO. So that would be invading a NATO partner. There's been lots of backup for Trump's position. Senator Ted Cruz, in a podcast, said when questioned about the idea of buying something, that everything is for sale. Now, I mean, that kind of offends at its core the very outlook of all the social democracies of the Nordic countries, especially Denmark, which operates entirely within its own bounds and within the Nordics on cooperation, not threat cooperation. And Greenland has been operating much the same way too. But America has form on this, because America actually has bought quite a few of its own states. It bought Louisiana in 1803. It bought Florida. Then Louisiana was actually bought from the French. Florida from the Spanish in 1821. They tried to buy Canada in 1850.
I would love to see Canada be the 51st state.
Buying Alaska from Russia in 1867. They tried to buy Greenland and Iceland a couple of times, but no dice. But they did actually buy the Danish West Indies from Denmark, and they have become the American Virgin Islands. That was in 1917, and you'll notice that's all a very long time ago. Even the most recent purchase from Denmark of tiny islands compared to the vast Greenland, and let's talk soon about the resources of Greenland, which makes another big difference, that's more than a century ago. Everything has changed since then, but this acquisitive outlook, it seems that Donald Trump is kind of back to the future, back to the 1800s in the way that the States founded some of its southern territories. So that's a problem. There's also actual form for the UK on this and for the Arctic, because the war, the Second World War, played a huge part in shaping how the Arctic worked. The UK actually invaded Iceland in 1940 at about the same time as Nazi Germany occupied the motherland Denmark. That was quite unpopular at the time in Iceland. They had no say about it at all. And when the British withdrew in 1941, they kind of gave Iceland to the Americans, who had an air base there at Keflavik until the early 2000s, when they withdrew, ironically, to more protests in Iceland, because by that stage, the income from the base really helped support the economy. But here we are now with America. And America had actually done much the same with Greenland in the Second World War. It signed an agreement with the Danish foreign minister, who was in exile at that point, because remember, his own land was occupied. And he agreed that the Americans could basically use Denmark like a protectorate for as long as it was necessary in security terms. And the Americans have really taken him at their word. Of course, back then, again, the Greenlanders had no say in that. So since then, the Americans have had an air base there. They've had it as a kind of early warning system, as a listening base. But then it kind of became a little more sinister. In the 1950s, a massive base was built there. And I mean, this really is the stuff of science fiction. But Camp Century was built in the early 1960s, 200 people there in an underground secret military base underneath the ice. It's extraordinary. Apparently there was laboratories, a church, a theatre, a hospital and a nuclear reactor. And apparently the Danes knew nothing about it. But there were plans to expand that and to actually have unbelievably 52 kilometres of underground systems underneath the ice, under Greenland, which was going to house up to 600 nuclear missiles. Now that didn't go ahead, but the constant surveillance of Greenland by nuclear-powered craft and craft carrying nuclear missiles, that has gone on pretty much since the 50s. There was a terrible accident in the 1960s when one such plane crashed. It caused radioactive contamination, and the workers who tried to deal with that situation, shipping the contaminated ice out of the area, many of them developed cancer, and it took them years, decades, to get compensation. So, you know, a kind of checkered history there for the Americans in Greenland. And that might be one reason why they're a wee bit wary, really, about just jumping back in. It might also be a reason why President Trump is so keen to get hold of Iceland. And that's a big, scary thought. Other reasons? Obviously, it's strategically important. It's on a passage that's opening all the time thanks to climate change, a sea route that connects America to Europe and Asia, and everybody, particularly Trump, is thinking about future markets and security, because that's the next thing. The fear is that if they don't get Greenland, who will? Well, maybe the Chinese. And then it's about resources, because Greenland has about 1/8 of the rare earth resources, rare minerals, which are used for things like lithium batteries, for all the sort of stuff that will fuel the green transition and revolution. China is the biggest processor of those, but Greenland is kind of going to be pretty useful. So that's another potential interest for President Trump. Mind you, you don't need to blooming invade a country to be able to do trade with it. His worry is that Chinese will get in there first. Maybe size. If Greenland was part of the United States, the States would jump from being the third largest country in the world after Russia and Canada to being the second. I know it wouldn't matter to me, but I'm not Donald Trump. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on there as possible motivations for Donald Trump, and you'd hope that nuclear thing is the least of it. But what about the Danish history with Greenland? It's not been tremendous either. Weirdly, the origins of the Danish ownership of Greenland come from Norway. Norway owned Iceland. The Icelanders, they were the ones who decided to make a foray towards America. This was Eric the Red way back in the 900s, 1000 period. And Eric the Red did set up a settlement on Greenland. And that's why it's called Greenland, because he was desperate to encourage settlers to come from Iceland to this glorious land of greenery and possibility, which Greenland, frankly, is not. 85% is covered with ice. So the colony was established, the word got back to Norway, and they assumed that the colony was still going. It wasn't. It died out pretty quickly. And actually, Greenland is really populated by Inuit people who came from further into Canada. However, that was Norway's opinion, and Norway was then taken over by Denmark. So Denmark basically gained the islands, thought that there was still a settlement there in the 1700s, sent out missionaries to whoever they could get, and essentially just in a de facto way just decided Greenland was Danish. It got formally incorporated into the Danish state, a bit like the Faroes, and the history for the Greenlanders was pretty poor. It was the Danish language that obtained. Until the 1970s, the majority of teachers were Danish. Even doctors, ministers, mostly Danish. So the Greenlandic society, economy and language and culture was really low priority. And all these expansions into military operations were destroying hunting and fishing, which climate change has done quite a lot to destroy as well. Nothing much came in its wake. And that's why Greenland's been left with really terrible, terrible social problems. East Greenland particularly, one of the police chiefs there, when he's hearing people talk about independence for Greenland, said he didn't want to hear people have holiday speeches for autonomy, whilst he was struggling with the fact that half the young people of Greenland have attempted suicide at one time or another. They've also got really high rates of teenage pregnancy, alcoholism, and sexual abuse of children. So it's not a good situation, and no one is suggesting that independence will cure the situation just like that. And yet, that's the trajectory that Greenland's actually on. because it got many powers back in 1979. It decided to leave the EEC at that point, for example, to protect its fishing fleet, whilst Denmark remained in. Quite a use of powers there for devolution. And it got essentially self-government in 2009, which has let them do many things, including take over most powers except foreign affairs, security, immigration, shipping. If they want to take those powers on, again like the Faroes, they can choose to do that when they can pay for it. And there's the rub, because at the moment, the Danes are subsidising the Greenlanders to the tune of about £430 million a year. How can they get that money? They thought it could have been oil. Cairn Energy, which is based in Edinburgh, did prospecting, 2 drilling sessions, just didn't find anything particularly, even though the estimates are amazing for how much is down there, something like 17 billion barrels. But it looks like it's going to stay, because Cairn gave up in 2010. The Greenland government decided there would be no more drilling for oil in light of the climate crisis in 2021. So that option has kind of closed. So it's back to the minerals. And there's worry there because one of the biggest mines has just been taken over by a company that has a Chinese parent company. So it's there to do, because all of those resources are precious. Some of them are radioactive, however, to extract. And that's the challenge for Greenland, is how to move towards what they all say they want, which is Greenland for Greenlanders, without being in the pockets of anyone at all. So what's likely to happen? Well, I'll stick my neck out and say Denmark has politely said no, and people are mistaking the characteristic politeness of the Danes as a kind of weakness. I think they're going to be rock solid on this, because what would they look like if they caved into this kind of bullying pressure from Donald Trump? I think he'll find other things to amuse himself with. He's already getting into deep water, handing out tariffs to countries like Colombia. He's threatening Denmark with the same. That is scary. Where's the rest of Europe on this? Because, you know, a hurt to one will soon be a hurt to all. And the Greenlanders at the core of all of this, perhaps this is a real boost to their ideas about independence. And perhaps they realise now that Greenland really has got a future, because look how many people are fighting over it. And perhaps that's the biggest benefit, the biggest boost to the Greenlanders that Donald Trump could ever have made.